The wind howled through the fields that night, cold enough to bite through layers of wool and skin. The man had finished his supper and was ready to sleep when he heard something strange outside, soft, uneven sounds, like someone sobbing or struggling to breathe. At first he thought it was just the wind catching on the old barn door again. But then, there it was, another sound, low and human. He grabbed his lantern and stepped into the storm. The snow was thick, crunching under his boots, the air sharp enough to sting his eyes. As he reached the barn, the light flickered in his trembling hand. The hinges groaned when he pushed the door open, revealing a shadow curled up in the corner. For a second he froze, then the shape moved. It wasn't an animal, it was a woman. Her dress was thin, torn, and covered in frost. Her lips were blue, her eyes wide and lost. She tried to speak, but only a broken whisper came out. He could barely believe what he was seeing. She looked like she had come straight from a wedding, only this one had ended in a nightmare. He knelt beside her, shaking her shoulder gently. Her skin was icy, her hands stiff. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her, but she barely reacted. The lantern light fell across her face, and that's when he realized who she was. He had seen her only once before, just days ago, standing beside his neighbor in a white gown, smiling nervously as vows were exchanged. The bride, his neighbor's new wife. What was she doing here? Why was she alone, freezing, hidden away in his barn in the middle of the night? Questions raced through his mind, but none of them mattered at that moment. He lifted her carefully, feeling how light she was, almost weightless, and carried her toward his house. Snow fell harder, blurring the path ahead. Every step was slow, heavy, urgent. Inside, he laid her near the fire, rubbing her hands to bring warmth back. She barely moved, her breathing shallow. He didn't know what had happened to her, or why she had been left to die, but one thing was certain. If he had waited any longer, she wouldn't have survived the night. The fire crackled softly, throwing a warm orange glow across the room. He sat beside her, still in disbelief. Her dress was soaked, stiff with ice, her hair tangled and wet. He could see the faint marks of frostbite on her fingers. She was breathing, but just barely. Every now and then her lips trembled, forming words that never came out. He poured a little water, but she couldn't drink yet. So he waited, watching the flames dance across the walls, listening to the storm scream outside. He'd lived on this land his whole life and thought he'd seen everything winter could do to a person. But this was something different. A young woman, still in her wedding dress, found half dead in his barn. He couldn't understand it. His neighbor had married her only last week. The town had talked about it, how sudden it was, how she'd come from far away, how quiet she seemed standing beside him. The neighbor, a man known more for his temper than his charm, had acted proud that day, as if marrying her was a prize. No one had questioned it. In small towns, people talk behind closed doors, not to your face. The man pulled a chair closer to the fire and waited, hoping she would wake. Her lashes fluttered once, twice, then her eyes opened. They were frightened, distant, like she wasn't sure if she was still alive. He spoke softly, trying not to startle her. He told her she was safe, that she was inside, that she didn't have to speak yet. She blinked at him, confused. Then she tried to sit up, but her body gave way. He caught her before she fell and eased her back onto the rug. She whispered something he couldn't catch. He leaned closer, and through chattering teeth, he finally heard her say a single word, "Please." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. He wrapped another blanket around her and added more wood to the fire. Slowly, color began to return to her face. Her breathing deepened. He offered her a cup of broth when she could finally hold it, her hands still trembling. Between each small sip he studied her. She looked delicate, but her eyes carried something heavy. Fear, shame, exhaustion. It wasn't just the cold that had nearly killed her. Outside, the wind began to calm. Snow piled high against the windows, sealing them in for the night. The house felt smaller, quieter, filled with the faint sound of her breath and the occasional crack of wood splitting in the fire. Hours passed before she spoke again. Her voice was low, shaky, almost a whisper to herself. She said she had nowhere else to go, that she thought she would die out there, that she hadn't meant to trespass, she just needed to hide. He told her it didn't matter. He wasn't angry. He only wanted her to rest. But she shook her head. Her eyes filled with tears that froze before they could fall. She tried to explain, but the words broke apart. He waited again. When she gathered the strength, she said her husband, his neighbor, had thrown her out, that there had been an argument, something about money, something about pride. She had refused to do something he wanted, and he had told her to leave. At first, she thought he was bluffing, but when he slammed the door, she realized he wasn't. She'd begged to be let in, barefoot in the snow, but the lights inside never turned back on. She walked for hours, she said. No direction, no plan, just walked. The storm got worse. Her veil tore away in the wind. Her hands went numb. When she saw the outline of his barn, she thought maybe she could last there until morning. But her body gave up before her will did. She lay down, certain that was the end. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the door opening. He listened without interrupting. The more she spoke, the more he realized how deep her fear ran. Not just of the cold, but of the man who had left her to die. The neighbor's cruelty wasn't news, but no one had seen this side of it before. People in town had always said he was short-tempered, but this was evil. She finished her story with her eyes fixed on the fire, as if afraid to look at him. Silence filled the room. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Instead, he stood, walked to the kitchen, and came back with another blanket. He draped it over her shoulders carefully. Her eyes met his for the first time, full of confusion and disbelief. Maybe she expected him to send her away, to tell her she didn't belong there. Instead, he only said, "You're safe now. Rest." She nodded faintly, though her expression showed she wasn't sure if she believed him. She kept glancing at the door, as if she expected her husband to burst in at any moment. He noticed that. So before leaving the room, he took the iron latch and secured the door. The storm might have been fading, but he wasn't taking chances. All night, he stayed awake. Every few minutes, he added wood to the fire. Sometimes she stirred, mumbling half-formed words, maybe dreams, maybe memories. Other times she just stared into the flames, lost in thought. He didn't press her. There would be time for questions later. For now, the only thing that mattered was keeping her alive. When dawn finally came, the snow had stopped. The world outside was silent and white, untouched except for the faint tracks leading from the barn to the house. Inside, the fire still burned. She was asleep, her breathing steady now. He watched her for a moment, then turned his gaze to the window. The light outside was cold and pure, the kind that makes everything look both beautiful and unforgiving. He wondered what the town would say when they found out. He wondered what his neighbor would do if he learned she was still alive. But deep down, he knew something had already changed. The moment he found her, his quiet life had taken a turn he could never undo. And though the world beyond his walls was frozen and still, inside that small house, something fragile had begun to thaw. When she woke again, the world outside was quiet. Morning light poured through the frosted window, soft and pale. She blinked a few times, confused by where she was. The last thing she remembered was the barn, the cold biting into her skin, the slow fading of her heartbeat. Now there was warmth, the smell of wood smoke, and the faint sound of someone moving around. The man was by the stove, stirring a pot. He looked over when he heard her shift. "You're awake," he said simply. His voice was gentle, low, as if he didn't want to scare her. She tried to speak, but her throat burned. He handed her a cup of warm milk, and she held it with both hands, staring at the steam before daring a sip. It was the first warmth she had felt in days. He asked her name. She hesitated, as if even that was a secret. Finally, she whispered, "Clara." He nodded and told her his Eli, a farmer living alone for years since his parents passed. A quiet man who spoke little, worked hard, and kept to himself. He told her not to worry, that no one would bother her here. She only nodded, still wary, still shivering even near the fire. The hours passed slowly. Clara kept her eyes on the flames, as though afraid that if she looked away, everything would vanish again. The warmth, the safety, even her own breath. Eli went about his chores quietly, giving her space. He brought in firewood, fed the animals, then returned with a bowl of stew. She thanked him in a voice so faint it almost disappeared in the air. He sat across from her, trying to think of what to say. She looked fragile, but there was something in her eyes, something that hadn't frozen with the rest of her. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said finally. "You just rest." But Clara shook her head. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "You should know, if he finds me he'll come for you too." Eli frowned. "Your husband," she nodded. Her hands clutched the blanket tighter. "He doesn't like people getting in his way. If he thinks I came here, he'll be angry." There was fear in her voice, not the kind that fades with time, but the kind that lives under the skin. He didn't say much. He didn't promise her that everything would be fine because he knew men like her husband, loud in public, cruel in private, always sure the world owed them obedience. But he wasn't about to turn her away. He had made his choice the moment he carried her in from the snow. Later that day, he went outside to clear the path between the barn and the house. The sky was still gray, heavy with more snow to come. The farm was silent, except for the soft cluck of hens and the creak of wood. Inside, Clara sat by the window, watching him work. There was something steady in his movements, each step slow, deliberate, like a man who'd learned to carry loneliness without letting it break him. When he came back in, she had fallen asleep again, her face turned toward the fire. He noticed how her dress, once white, was now dull and torn, stained from mud and frost. It didn't seem right for her to stay wrapped in something that belonged to a day filled with lies. He brought an old blanket and some of his mother's clothes from a trunk in the attic. When she woke again, he left them near her chair and turned away so she could change. By evening, she looked different. Still pale, still weak, but no longer like a ghost. Her hair was brushed, her hands no longer shaking as badly. She sat at the table, eating slowly. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt natural, as though words weren't needed. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "I used to think I could fix him," she said. Her voice was soft, almost as if she were confessing to herself. "He wasn't always cruel. At first he was kind. Or maybe I only wanted to believe that." She smiled bitterly. "He changed after the wedding. Said I didn't respect him enough. That I made him look weak. I tried to be a good wife, but nothing was ever enough." Eli didn't interrupt. He just listened, eyes steady, letting her pour out the words she'd been holding in for too long. She spoke about the nights filled with shouting, the silence that followed, the fear that grew heavier each day. About how he stopped calling her by name. About the night she finally ran, barefoot, desperate, not caring where she went as long as it wasn't there. As she spoke, something in Eli's chest tightened. He'd seen cruelty before in small ways, the way people could turn cold for power or pride, but never like this. There was a kind of quiet rage in him now, not wild or reckless, but deep and steady. The wind picked up again outside, rattling the shutters. Clara flinched at the sound, instinctively shrinking back. Eli noticed. "You're safe here," he said again, not as comfort but as fact. She nodded, though her eyes stayed on the window. That night he made up a small bed near the fire and gave her his own blanket. She protested at first, but he refused to listen. He slept in the chair by the door, just in case. Every time the wind howled or a branch snapped outside, she stirred, and he would murmur quietly, "It's just the wind." Somewhere in the early hours, the storm returned in full. Snow slammed against the roof. The house creaked and the fire struggled to stay alive. Clara sat up, frightened. Eli was already awake. He added more wood to the flames, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no fear in his, only calm, steady warmth. It was the first time she looked at him and didn't see a stranger. The storm raged on, but inside that small room something had shifted. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt safe. And for the first time since her wedding day, Clara felt that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. Days passed quietly after the storm. The world outside stayed buried under snow, untouched and silent. Inside the small farmhouse, the fire never went out. Eli made sure of that. Every morning he rose before dawn, adding wood, boiling water, moving carefully so he wouldn't wake her. Clara slept longer now, her body finally healing after days of hunger and cold. Sometimes she would wake with a start, clutching the blanket, her eyes wide and uncertain. Each time, Eli spoke softly from the other side of the room, reminding her where she was. She'd relax, whisper a faint thank you and drift back to sleep. By the third morning she was strong enough to walk around. Her steps were slow but determined. Eli found her standing by the window, wrapped in one of his old coats, watching the sunlight glint off the snow. She looked small against the vast white landscape, but there was something new in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of life. He brought her a bowl of oatmeal and smiled when she took it without hesitation. "You'll need your strength," he said. "This cold isn't going anywhere soon." She nodded and ate quietly, her gaze distant. After a while she spoke. "I keep thinking about him," she said, "wondering if he even noticed I was gone." Her tone was calm, not bitter, just hollow, like someone remembering a ghost. Eli didn't know what to say. He could lie, tell her that man was probably sorry, but they both knew better. Later that day, she offered to help around the house. He refused at first, saying she needed rest, but she insisted. "I can't just sit," she said, her voice stronger now. "I need to do something." So he handed her small tasks, drying dishes, folding linens, brushing the floor. She worked in silence, steady and focused, as if each simple chore helped her piece herself back together. As the sun began to fade, Eli stepped outside to chop wood. The sound of the axe echoed through the still air. From the doorway, Clara watched him. The rhythm of his movements was almost peaceful, swing, crack, breathe. For the first time in days, she felt something close to calm. The man who had saved her didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He just offered what he had: warmth, safety, and quiet. And that quiet was something she hadn't known in a long time. That night after dinner, they sat by the fire. The house creaked softly as it settled. Clara stared at the flames, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke again. "I used to dream about running away," she said. "Before the wedding, I thought it would be freedom. But when it finally happened, it didn't feel that way. It felt like falling." Eli looked at her, but she kept her eyes on the fire. "I thought I'd never stop being afraid," she added. "But when you opened that door, it felt like I could breathe again." He didn't answer right away. He just nodded slightly, letting her words hang in the warm air between them. Then he said, "Sometimes, the hardest thing isn't running away. It's deciding you deserve to live after you do." She turned to him then, her expression unreadable. Maybe she hadn't expected kindness from anyone anymore. Maybe she had forgotten what it sounded like. Over the next few days, their rhythm settled into something natural. He worked outside. She helped inside. She mended torn curtains, tended to the fire, and made bread from the little flour he had left. She even laughed once quietly when his old dog tried to steal a loaf off the counter. The sound startled both of them. It had been so long since laughter had filled that house. But not every moment was easy. Some nights she woke up screaming, trapped in dreams she couldn't escape. Eli would rush to her side, his voice calm, steady, repeating her name until she remembered where she was. In the morning, she'd always apologize, eyes downcast, but he'd shake his head and tell her there was nothing to be sorry for. As the days blended together, the snow began to melt, just a little. The world outside was still cold but softer. One afternoon, Clara stepped out into the yard, the weak sun brushing her face. It was the first time she'd been outside since that night. She stood there quietly, breathing in the crisp air, her hands clasped together. Eli watched from the porch, saying nothing. She looked back at him and smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling as if she had forgotten how. "It's beautiful," she said. He nodded. "It is." She turned back toward the horizon, her hair catching the light. For a moment she looked like someone entirely new, not the broken, freezing bride he had found, but a woman standing on the edge of beginning again. When she finally went back inside, her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her eyes were brighter. That evening, she helped him fix the window shutters that had cracked in the storm. They worked side by side without many words, moving in easy rhythm. The quiet between them wasn't empty anymore. It was comfortable, filled with understanding. When the last nail was hammered in place, she stood back and said softly, "Thank you for everything." He met her gaze and replied, "You don't owe me thanks. I just did what anyone should do." But she shook her head. No, not everyone would have opened that door. He didn't have an answer for that, so he just smiled, faint and honest. When night fell, they sat by the fire again, sharing the last of the bread she'd baked. Outside, the wind carried a gentler sound now. Clara leaned back, watching the flames curl and dance. Her voice was steady when she spoke this time. "I don't know what's next," she said. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Eli looked at her for a long moment before replying, "You don't have to know yet. Sometimes life starts again before we realize it." She didn't reply, but she smiled slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that maybe he was right. The firelight flickered against her face, soft and golden, and for the first time since that terrible night, she didn't look haunted. She just looked alive. And as the snow continued to melt outside, drip by drip, the house that once stood in silence began to feel like something more than shelter. It began to feel like a place where two broken lives had crossed at the exact moment they needed to. The days turned into weeks, and winter slowly loosened its grip on the land. The snowbanks began to shrink, revealing patches of earth beneath them. The air, though still cold, carried a hint of spring. Clara had begun to move through the house with quiet confidence now. The woman who once trembled at every sound was starting to find her rhythm again. She swept the floors, mended torn shirts, and fed the animals while Eli worked outside. He didn't ask her to, she simply wanted to. Each small task seemed to bring her a little closer to feeling human again. One morning, Eli came back from the barn with his sleeves rolled up and hands raw from the cold. He found Clara kneeling near the stove, humming softly as she stirred a pot of soup. It was the first time he'd heard her hum. It was faint, uncertain, like she was still learning how to fill silence with something other than fear. He stopped at the doorway, watching her for a moment. She noticed and turned with a startled smile. "You must be freezing," she said. "Sit, I'll get you something warm." He chuckled softly. "You don't have to take care of me." But she only shook her head. "You took care of me first." After they ate, she stepped outside with him for the first time to help with the animals. The ground was slick with melting snow, but she didn't mind. She laughed when one of the goats tried to steal the hem of her coat. Eli looked at her then, really looked, and saw how different she seemed. The shadows under her eyes had faded. Her hair, once dull and tangled, caught the sunlight like fine gold threads. There was still fragility in her, but now it was mixed with strength, the kind that comes from surviving something terrible. That night as they sat by the fire, she spoke about her old life again, though this time her voice was steadier. "He used to say I owed him everything," she murmured, staring into the flames. "That no one else would ever want me. After a while I believed him. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a person anymore, just a mistake." She paused, her throat tightening. "But you, when you looked at me that night, you didn't see that. You didn't look at me with pity." Eli didn't move. His voice was low when he finally replied, "Everyone deserves to be seen as a person. You were just unlucky enough to meet someone who forgot that." Clara turned her head toward him, her eyes shining faintly in the firelight. For the first time, she didn't look away. "You make it sound simple," she said softly. "Maybe it is," he answered, though his tone carried something heavier, like he was speaking as much to himself as to her. The following morning, a wagon appeared on the distant road. Eli noticed it while splitting wood and stiffened immediately. He wiped his hands, squinting through the glare of sunlight on snow. Two men were riding, their faces half hidden under hats. He recognized one of them instantly, his neighbor, the man who had left Clara to die. Eli's jaw tightened. He turned toward the house and saw Clara at the window. She froze when she saw the wagon too. For a heartbeat, everything around them went silent except the creak of wheels and the distant caw of a crow. "Stay inside," Eli said quietly, his tone calm but firm. She didn't argue. Her hands shook as she stepped back from the window. Eli met the men at the gate. His neighbor's face was red from the cold, his eyes sharp and suspicious. "Heard you been keeping company," the man said with a smirk. "I've been missing someone." Eli didn't flinch. "You mean the woman you threw into a snowstorm?" The smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl. "She's my wife," the man spat, "and she belongs with me." Eli stood tall, his expression unreadable. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said quietly. The man laughed bitterly. "Don't play hero, Eli. You know how people talk. You keep her here, they'll turn on you too." Eli didn't answer right away. He looked past him at the empty road, at the pale horizon that seemed to stretch forever. Then he said, "Let them talk." The man cursed and spat in the snow before turning his horse around. "This isn't over," he shouted, but his voice sounded small against the wind. Eli didn't move until the wagon disappeared into the distance. Only then did he return to the house. Clara was sitting by the table, pale and trembling. She looked at him with fear, her voice breaking when she spoke. "He'll come back," she whispered. "He won't stop." Eli knelt beside her, his voice steady as a stone. "He might try," he said, "but he won't find you alone again." She didn't answer, just stared at him with wide eyes, unsure whether to believe him. But something in his tone, calm, certain, made her shoulders relax. She reached out, hesitant at first, then placed her hand on his. It was a small gesture, but it carried all the trust she hadn't been able to give anyone for a long time. That evening, the tension still hung heavy in the air. Eli checked the door twice, made sure the firewood was stacked high, and left the lantern burning through the night. Clara sat quietly, wrapped in a blanket. After a long silence, she said, "You shouldn't have stood up to him. He's dangerous." Eli looked at her, the faintest smile crossing his lips. "So am I when someone needs protecting." Something in his calmness steadied her. For the first time since that knock on the barn door, she didn't feel hunted. She felt guarded, seen, worth the trouble. As the night deepened, she found herself drifting into sleep by the fire. Eli watched her for a moment, her face peaceful, her breathing soft. Then he leaned back in his chair, the weight of what had happened settling over him. He knew the man might return, that trouble could still come, but he also knew he wouldn't let fear undo what had already begun to heal. The wind outside had changed again. It no longer sounded like claws scraping at the walls. It sounded like the whisper of something new, something beginning. Inside that small house, beneath the crackling of the fire and the faint rhythm of their breaths, two lives that had once been broken were slowly, quietly, starting to build something that neither of them could name yet. Spring came quietly that year, slipping in without fanfare. The snow melted in slow sighs, filling the ditches with water that shimmered in the sunlight. The fields, once lifeless and gray, began to stir with patches of green. Birds returned, their calls echoing through the still air. For the first time in months, the world around the farmhouse didn't feel like a trap, it felt alive. Clara spent more time outside now, her steps sure, her face turned toward the light. She helped Eli with the garden, her hands sinking into the cool soil as if grounding herself back into the world. Eli watched her sometimes, quietly, from the corner of his eye. She'd hum while she worked, her hair pulled back, her sleeves rolled. There was strength in her movements now, a quiet determination. He didn't interrupt her much. He knew some silences needed to stay that way. The pain she carried hadn't vanished, it lingered just beneath the surface, but it no longer ruled her. Each day seemed to peel away another layer of fear, revealing something new underneath. One morning, as they were planting seedlings, Clara looked up and smiled at him. "I used to hate spring," she said softly. "It always felt like the world was waking up while I was still stuck in winter." Eli paused, his hands still in the dirt. "And now?" he asked. She looked out across the field, her eyes tracing the horizon. "Now it feels like I finally caught up." Her voice was quiet but sure. He nodded, saying nothing. Some truths didn't need replies. The days grew longer and life settled into a kind of gentle rhythm. They worked in the fields, fixed the fences, cooked simple meals, and ended each evening by the fire. Sometimes she told small stories about her childhood, about climbing trees, about her mother's garden, about laughter that used to come easily. Other nights she fell silent, and Eli didn't press. He'd simply add another log to the fire and sit with her, the flames painting both their faces in shades of gold and amber. One afternoon, Clara took one of Eli's old shirts and began stitching it near the window. He came in from the barn, brushing dust off his coat, and noticed her work. "Didn't think anyone would bother fixing that," he said with a grin. "It's got more holes than cloth," she smiled. "Then it just needs a little more patience." He watched her fingers move with care, the needle glinting in the light. "You've got a steady hand," he said. "You've got a steady heart," she replied without looking up. It caught him off guard. He didn't answer, but something in his chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. That night, rain fell, soft at first, then heavy. It beat against the windows, turning the air thick with the smell of wet earth. Clara stood by the doorway, watching the water pour from the roof. "I used to hate the sound of rain," she said quietly. "He didn't like it when I left the window open, said it made him restless." Eli, who was by the fire, looked over. "What about now?" She turned to him, her face soft but steady. "Now it sounds like freedom." She smiled faintly, and in that moment Eli saw something that had been missing for so long, a lightness that no storm could take away. The next morning the world smelled new again. The fields glistened under the sun, and the air was fresh, alive. Clara went outside barefoot, feeling the damp grass beneath her feet. She lifted her face to the sky, eyes closed, breathing deeply. When she turned back toward the house, Eli was standing at the door, leaning against the frame, watching her. "You'll catch cold," he said, though his tone carried no real scolding. She laughed, an easy, genuine sound, and walked back toward him. "You worry too much," she teased. "Someone has to," he replied, but he was smiling too. Later that week, a letter arrived from town. It came in the hands of a rider passing through, curious to see if Eli still lived alone. The letter was for Clara. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but her hands trembled as she held it. She opened it slowly, reading in silence. Eli didn't ask what it said, but he saw her expression change from tension to relief to something softer. When she finally looked up, she said, "He's gone, left town, sold the farm." Her voice shook, not from fear this time, but from release. She folded the letter neatly, set it on the table, and whispered, "It's over." For a long while they didn't speak. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, the wind stirred the new leaves. Eli finally said, "You don't owe him anything anymore." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I know, but it still feels strange, doesn't it, to be free?" He met her gaze, his own steady and warm. "Freedom always feels strange at first. It takes time to believe it's real." She smiled faintly, and that was all that needed to be said. As the weeks passed, the farm grew brighter, busier. The fields bloomed, the animals grew restless with energy. Clara laughed more often now, sometimes for no reason at all. Eli found himself smiling more too, though he never quite knew why. It wasn't just gratitude or kindness. It was something deeper, quieter, like two lives learning how to fit beside each other without taking anything away. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat outside watching the sun dip below the hills. The sky turned gold, then pink, then deep blue. Clara leaned forward, resting her arms on her knees. "Do you ever think about the day you found me?" she asked. "Every day," Eli replied. "I thought you were an angel at first," she said with a small laugh. "A very tired, cold angel," he chuckled. "You didn't look much like one," he said. "You looked like a ghost." She laughed again, but then her tone softened. "You saved me," he shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just opened the door." The light faded slowly, wrapping the land in calm. Fireflies blinked in the distance. Clara glanced at him, her face illuminated by the last traces of daylight. "You know," she said quietly, "I think this place gave me back my life." Eli looked out across the fields, the faint breeze carrying the scent of fresh earth. "Maybe it gave me back mine too," he said. Neither of them spoke after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy or broken. It was peaceful, alive. The world around them hummed softly, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. The past, once sharp and cold, seemed to melt away with the last of the light, leaving only the quiet rhythm of two hearts learning to live again.